Now it's time to write the last test implementation in this file, which tests function called id. This is a pretty simple function, as we can see. But the technique we're going to use in order to test this function will be drastically different compared to previous functions. Because if we'll take a closer look at the implementation of this function, we can see that this function uses a couple of default objects provided by JavaScript. And what's even more tricky is that those functions, such as now on the date object or random on the mass object, they will always return different results anytime we're gonna call them, because method now on the date object depends on the current date, and method random on the mass object will return new random value anytime we're gonna call it. So in order to test this function, we should somehow force these methods return expected results. Otherwise, we're not going to be able to test this function. So the main goal of this id function is to generate random string identifiers. I'm going to switch over to the test file, and let's try to call this function once and see what this function is going to return. I'm going to print out the result in a console. So right here we can see the generated string, and if we're gonna rerun the test, we're going to see a different string, because anytime we're gonna call function id, we'll receive different identifier. So to make this function predictable, we should somehow make method now as well as method random return some predefined value which will not be dependent on the current time. Fortunately, Vite provides us with a way to do so pretty easily. First of all, we're gonna have to import object called vi from the Vitest library, and then we're gonna call method spy_on, which accepts two arguments. First one is an object where we're going to mock the method on, and the second argument is the method name itself that we have to mock, or that we need to spy on. In this case, we need to mock the return value of the function now, so that anytime we're gonna call it, we're going to get expected result. And we can mock the return value of the function by calling method mockReturnValue once and providing the result that we want this function to return. In this case, it doesn't really matter which result it is going to return, so I'm going to use 1. Before going any further, let's firstly comment out this line and make sure that method now is going to return different value anytime we're going to rerun tests. So we see that return value changes every time I refresh test execution. But if we're gonna use spy_on method call and check the result again, this time, regardless of how many times we will refresh test execution, we will always get predefined value 1, which we have specified when calling mockReturnValue once function. So now we're gonna do the same for the other function, which our function id depends on. It is a random function on the mass object. In this case, I'm going to make this function to return 10,000. As always, before continuing with implementation, let's just make sure that random method call is going to return 10,000. So now that we have mocked return values of both of these functions, now and random, we can check the final result of this whole function id. Let's switch back to the test file and see what this function is going to return now. So it always returns string 1s. And this is what we're going to check. I'm gonna call expect and check the return value, comparing it with 1s string, like so. And the test is passing, but if we will comment out either of these spy_on method calls, test is going to fail, because in this case, function id depends on the random value generated by the random function of the mass object. So the reason we have mocked both of these functions now and random is that these functions are provided by JavaScript itself, which means that we haven't written those functions and we don't have to test them. We only have to test our code that we wrote ourselves. And by making the function id not be dependent on the current time or any random number, we were able to check return value of this function. Also regarding mock return value once method call, which we will mock return value of some function only once. For the one method execution, there is also another function called mock return value, which mocks return value of the function forever, regardless of how many times we would call that function. But in this particular case, mocking the return value only once worked for us. Link to the source code of this lesson will be in the video description.